So there's a lot of buzz about using marijuana to treat COVID, but is it real? Let's get into it. Welcome to The Feed with Dr. G. Humans have been using marijuana for over 5,000 years. It's been consumed in various different ways and thought to have various health benefits. Unfortunately, most of those claims are not proven. So what do we know about the possible medical benefits of marijuana? First, it's important to understand the different components inside marijuana. So marijuana itself, and we call it cannabis because it comes from the cannabis plant, has almost 500 different chemical compounds in it. The two most common substances are tetrahydrocannabinol, you may know it as THC, and cannabidiol, which we call CBD. So the THC part is what actually gives you that high of marijuana, and the CBD part is what's mostly been studied for its medical effects. But how does COVID-19 come into all of this? Well, it's these two recently published studies that really have people talking.
Researchers at Oregon State University believe they may have found a natural way to ward off the virus, and that natural way is cannabis.
The first study looked at whether extracts from the cannabis plant could actually block the virus from entering our cells. So we know that the coronavirus has these spike proteins along its surface, and it uses those spikes to bind to these receptors on human cells so it can get into those cells. So these researchers set out to look for chemicals in marijuana that could actually attach to that spike protein and block it. They identified two chemicals that do seem to attach really well. Then they took the virus, exposed it to those chemicals, and put it in a dish with monkey cells that are known to be susceptible to the virus. And they found that when the virus had been exposed to those compounds, it had a harder time infecting those cells.
Apparently, a compound found in cannabis prevents the virus that causes COVID from penetrating healthy human cells.
So yeah, they did conclude that these marijuana extracts might reduce the ability of the virus to infect our cells when we breathe it in. Then there was a second study that not only looked at whether CBD blocks entry into cells, but also what it does once the virus has already entered cells. And what they showed is that when the virus gets into the cell, the CBD seems to prevent it from replicating or making copies of itself. Then they took this one step further and they actually tested it in mice. So they gave the mice CBD for 5 days, then they exposed them to the coronavirus. And the mice that had taken the CBD had much lower levels of the virus in their nasal passages and their lungs than the mice that hadn't. So they concluded that CBD might actually reduce the severity of a COVID infection by preventing the virus from actually growing. So, two really interesting studies. But let's talk about some caveats. The first problem is that although the second study showed that cannabis compounds can block the virus from replicating, it also found that they're not particularly effective at blocking the virus from actually entering the cells. And that's actually the opposite finding to the first study. The other caveat is that the second study showed that when you mix in the THC, which is that other component in marijuana, along with the CBD, it actually blocks the beneficial effect of the CBD. So this is not a benefit you could get from just smoking marijuana because that contains both THC and CBD. But the biggest caveat is that none of these studies were in humans. It may work well in a lab dish when it's tested on monkey cells, it may work in lab mice, but that doesn't mean it'll work in you and me. In fact, 96% of drugs that work in animal studies don't succeed in human trials. Because it turns out that mice and humans are pretty different.
Because I smoke weed all day, every day, and all day, every day, and all day, every day, and all night.
Yeah. So is this research promising? For sure. But do we know that marijuana actually helps with COVID infection? Not until we have human studies. What we do know is that prevention is much better than treatment. And we have a prevention approach that reduces COVID infection, even with the Omicron variant, and dramatically reduces the chances of severe infection. And that's the COVID vaccine. Not only were those COVID vaccines tested on cells in a lab and on animals, but they were also proven in studies with thousands of humans. And since then, over 4 billion people around the world have been successfully vaccinated against COVID. So you might have all sorts of good reasons to consider using marijuana, but helping with COVID just isn't one of them, at least for now. If you want to avoid getting COVID, and especially avoid getting sick from COVID, your best bet's to go out and get vaccinated. If you want to see any of the studies we talked about, they're linked below. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. If you want to see more health and science videos, subscribe to the feed. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.